Speaking of players left out of World Cup squads, the build-up to the 1998 World Cup from an England perspective was pretty interesting. This is one of those tournaments that, from England's perspective, lives in infamy, and this is what we're going to talk about in just a moment. I would let you know that if anybody wants to get in touch with us here, you can tweet the show at Off The Ball, or you can text us here. You can't text us of a morning. You can tweet us at Off The Ball AM.
You've got your own number if you want.
Yeah, we should get our own WhatsApp, shouldn't we? Just a random... Yeah. We will do that. That was many of the off the word spoke true in jest is the phrase that I was looking for there. Yeah, you can send us your abuse and whatever those pictures that we'll have to pixelate out for you of a morning. Daniel Harris is on the line. Good morning, Daniel. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. We're talking about the 1998 World Cup here as maybe a means of comparing, contrasting how England might do 20 years on in Russia. But the build-up to the World Cup in 98 was kind of overshadowed somewhat by the decision not to bring Paul Gascoigne. And yet, in retrospect, it looks like probably it was a good idea, right?
Yeah, I think history has treated Glenn Hoddle nicely on that one. I think perhaps he maybe should have made sure that decision didn't become a flashpoint by making it earlier than he did, so that he didn't get rid of a few players who thought they might be going to the World Cup just before the World Cup. But the actual decision to get rid of Gazza, it's hard to say that wasn't the right one. In fact, I'm pretty sure that was the right one. And it gave us some interesting stories in the meantime.
So was the timing the issue around that? Or, like, was there a better way to handle that? Or was it actually by bringing Gazza in, that meant that was what the focus was on and kind of actually allowed the rest of the squad to develop in the background?
I guess it's sort of, you gave Gazza the opportunity to then flip. And then you could say, well, clearly I can't take that person to the World Cup if that's what they're going to do. And Gascoigne was quite close to finish by then anyway. And it then gave him the opportunity to promote Paul Scholes, who'd done really well in the tournoi a year earlier. But no, I think that just on a human level, having that situation where you have a squad that is too big for the amount of people you're allowed to take to the World Cup with you, I just don't imagine it can be good for anyone to then cull that squad very obviously, because you've got then people are forming bonds, and you have the members of the squad who are going, seeing their mates, getting told that they're not going to the World Cup, and you have all the tears and the anger that comes with that. I just don't believe that can be particularly good for morale. So
just to recap, the Euros in '96 was this transcendent moment for English football, which ultimately ends in heartbreaking failure. The tournament was brilliant. It was kind of the re-emergence of English football on the world stage as something, a force for positive. The football was great. You know, Gazza nearly stretches to get the winner against Germany in extra time. And, there's enough there for everybody to think, ooh, this is actually really potentially interesting into the future. And then Terry Venables is no longer the head coach and Glenn Hoddle takes over, and the atmosphere changes a little bit almost immediately.
It's quite funny, that whole Euro 1996 thing, because England played well in that tournament for not very long at all. Rubbish against Switzerland in the first game, rubbish for most of the game against Scotland, good for 20 minutes against Holland, rubbish for most of the game against Spain and lucky to get through on penalties, and then they played really well against Germany. And I think Venables actually doesn't get as much heat as perhaps he earned. So I'd forgotten until quite recently that in that game against Germany, he played the same 11 for 120 minutes in a semi-final of a European competition. And on the bench, you had Robbie Fowler and Les Ferdinand, for example. And then they get to penalties, and Paul Ince, Tony Adams allowed Gareth Southgate, a defender who's played in his first tournament, to take a crucial penalty. McManaman, another one, didn't take a penalty. But they seem to generally, that whole team are treated as heroes, when there's some fairly significant errors there that you would say the manager perhaps could have brought players on for penalties or just brought some strikers on, and then the senior pros could have taken the penalties. But it's true that, everyone who's played for Terry Venables more or less seems to say that playing for Venables was great, and Venables was a great manager, and people are more mixed with Hoddle. But in 1998, England still went to tournaments with the press or lots of English people thinking that they had a good chance of winning it. And 1998 was an interesting competition again, because the way that Hoddle husbanded the squad in some ways was really good. Like, the players he put on the pitch played well, and they rose to the occasion in the big game against Argentina. And yet they shouldn't really have been playing Argentina, because they shouldn't have got beaten by Romania in the second group game. And why was that? You can't say that if Hoddle had done one thing, another thing would have happened, but he didn't play David Beckham in the first game or the second game, which seemed quite a lot like an egotistical power play. And he also picked Sheringham, who wasn't in form and had a rubbish club season, instead of Michael Owen, who was in form and devastating. He brought Owen off the bench against Romania. He scored. England lost anyway, but because they lost that game to Romania, they ended up having to play Argentina in the second round because they went through second in the group.
So 1996, you say there was a moment when the England team perhaps didn't get as much heat as they deserved. So would you say that 1998 was the first time that an England squad looked around and thought to themselves, right, okay, we've got this added conflict here, which is the English press?
I think there've been plenty of aggravation prior to then. I mean, if you speak to Graham Taylor, I'm sure he'll tell you that the aggravation was nothing new, and Bobby Robson got plenty of it as well. But what 1996 did was it wasn't just about football. It captured that moment, that intersection of great football, a tournament in England that went really well, Britpop, Tony Blair, where the mood in the country was different to how it had been for a generation, more or less, in that it wasn't just that people were happy, because obviously individual people can be happy all the time, but there was more this kind of national sense of happiness and England, Great Britain being a good place to be, and this confluence of popular culture with political culture, and all these things happened at the same time. So, and football more or less exists to make people happy, and people were happy at that point, so it became this moment that existed outside of itself. It wasn't just about the football and just about the errors that Terry Venables made and that the players made. Whereas by 1998, things had changed slightly, but even so, that game against Argentina was an epic. It was for me, if your team loses in an epic encounter, there's still something uplifting about that. And I think that people still felt there was regret, but there weren't a lot of brickbats that were handed out subsequently, or at least David Beckham tolerated them all, whereas Hoddle again got away with causing that tie against Argentina. He also said in his book that he should have brought Eileen Drury to France sooner, and so he didn't get any blame for that either. And who knows what wonders Eileen Drury could have wrought to help England out. And Alan Shearer was another one who got away with it. If you're, like I am, a fan of celebrated disallowed goals, where the player scores, he goes into the crowd, he swings his shirt around his head, he does all those things, and then realises sometime later that the goal has been disallowed. One of the all-time great ones of those is Sol Campbell scores a header against Argentina, and he's, this guy, I feel I must start crying even thinking about it. He's experiencing the moment of his life. His hands are in the air, his eyes are closed, he's absolutely buzzing, and it turns out that Alan Shearer has elbowed the Argentina goalkeeper, and the goal is disallowed. It's on YouTube, it's hilarious, but at the same time, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And in turn, that makes it even more hilarious. And that's what football's all about. But Shearer got no heat for a completely unnecessary barge on the goalkeeper and getting that goal disallowed. Whereas David Beckham, if you think about that afterwards, what went on, I think people have almost forgotten. It wasn't just effigies in pubs. It was actually a targeted and institutional attack. There was a headline, I think, in the Mirror saying, "Still bitter, take your fury out on our Beckham dartboard." Then there was another headline later on, "Hate mob targets Beckham family." Hate mob targets Beckham family. Are you kidding me? And then outside Mansfield Road Baptist Church, there was one of those boards, "God forgives even David Beckham." And which is quite funny when you think about it, really. And when you think about where David Beckham is now and the things that he has been forgiven for subsequently, that you might consider to be more significant than flicking the boot at Diego Simeone.
To what extent did Glenn Hoddle fan the flames around David Beckham at that point? Because he wasn't exactly overly protective of him in the immediate post-match interviews of that Argentina game.
No. And I don't think they got on too well, if all the stories that you hear are to be believed. The volley, they were trying the volley from the corner move, and Beckham couldn't do it. And Glenn Hoddle said, whatever, it's something like, "You're not quite good enough to do this kind of skill." And lots of players say that about Glenn Hoddle, but one of the things he wanted them to know was that he was better at football than they were. And in a sense, that's not a terrible thing, that you should respect your manager. And that was one of Glenn Hoddle's things. One of the reasons you would respect Glenn Hoddle, one of the things you would listen to Glenn Hoddle was that he was a good player. Although I'd say that David Beckham's career stacks up fairly well against Glenn Hoddle's career. But it's true that, Glenn Hoddle didn't want to accept any of the blame himself, because that's not what he did. Perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it was, in fact, a sin that Glenn Hoddle had committed in a previous life that made him make these errors, that made him get beaten. Who's to say? Who's to say? But I think that, he didn't protect Beckham, but I'm not sure that there was very much he could have done, because we've seen what our tabloid culture is like, and our tabloid culture attacks people now, even now, where we're supposed to have evolved and be slightly more responsible. Our tabloid culture is attacking people viciously for doing a lot less than David Beckham did. On the other hand, it makes you wonder quite how Harry Kane would have coped with that, given how upset he got about a goal that he did or didn't score, and a joke about him not doing much against Chris Smalling in the Cup semi-final. If you compare what he got to this, then you wonder quite how he would have handled that.
I think Beckham's recovery from what happened in 1998 is like the hallmark of a truly great sports person. And like whatever the debates about the order of that Manchester United midfield, or like who was the best of that Giggs, Beckham, Scholes, Keane midfield, and you know, they were this perfect combination. He might have been the hardest working, even in a battle against Roy Keane. It certainly wasn't the most talented. That would have been Giggs or Scholes. But what he recovered from versus what everybody else has had to go through makes him a truly great sports person.
100%. And people forget that because he's now David Beckham in inverted commas with capital letters and italics and underlined. People forget that David Beckham was a brilliant football player. And the following season, when United won the treble, he was possibly United's greatest ever player. United's best player in the greatest ever season delivered by a British club. And that is very significant. And it's not, people forget that he wasn't just about the crosses, and he wasn't just about the work. He was about someone who could put it all together and deliver in the biggest moments. David Beckham's best game for United was probably the game against Juventus, when United came back from 2-0 down to get into the final of the Champions League. He took the two corners under pressure with which United won the Champions League. He scored against Arsenal in the Cup semi-final. I mean, the list goes on. And I think what you've got is with David Beckham, with Paul Scholes, Ryan Giggs, is Alex Ferguson taking very, very different personalities and using his ability to hone them into these maniacal, insane competitors who were never satisfied unless they were winning, and were able to find the calmness under pressure, like the stillness in the mayhem that enables you to deliver and to perform your skill at clutch, basically. And there aren't very many people that are able to do that. And what Beckham got, the kind of hatred that Beckham was getting early in that part of the season, I guess came with an upside as well, in that there was a lot of people that hated him, but it meant that the people that loved him gave him more love than he would ordinarily have got, which might have been some kind of buzz also. And if you're able to channel the hatred into performance, as a lot of the best sportsmen are, I mean, you see it, Chris Eubank is a good example of that. Someone who was able to absorb the hatred, absorb it, and then reflect it back out as power or strength or whatever you want to call it. And that requires a phenomenal mental strength and fibrous character. Not everyone can cope with that.
Yeah, it's interesting when you compare that to the current situation with Raheem Sterling, and it seems that the majority of the public, or potentially, maybe it isn't the majority of the public, maybe it's just the majority of the public who use apps like Twitter and stuff like that, seem to have resisted the tabloid campaign against Raheem Sterling. Was that the same in '98? Was the British public as receptive to tabloid headlines as they are now, or a lack of reception? Were they kind of resistant to these sort of campaigns against players like David Beckham?
It's harder to know, because I guess we weren't wasting our lives on Twitter at that point.
Yeah.
So we didn't have quite such an obvious gauge of what people are thinking. I felt like most sensible people clearly could see that Beckham had made a mistake. He got sent off, and that didn't mean that those things happen in a game of football. So it's hard to see whether, because you don't go to football matches, and football matches create a very particular kind of environment. So if you go to a football match and your team is playing against David Beckham, and you can see a potential weak point in David Beckham, if you get after David Beckham, it doesn't mean that you believe all the tabloid stuff. It means that you sensed a weakness, and that's what football is partly about. It's exploiting the weaknesses of your opponents, and not just their weaknesses on the pitch, but any emotional weakness you might have. So I don't think that necessarily that Steven Gerrard's slipping is why Liverpool didn't win the league. But when I was at Anfield as a supporter the next season, of course I was part of the United end that was getting after Steven Gerrard, that saw him then get sent off 30 seconds after he came on, because that's part of football. It's part of exploiting the weakness of your opponents, whether you believe it or not. The Raheem Sterling thing is different, though, because we're talking about racism. we're not talking about exploiting the weakness of an opponent. We're talking about dog whistle racism, and we're talking about outward, obvious, in-your-face racism. So at that point, there becomes no excuse for anyone to play on that kind of weakness and to believe and absorb what the tabloids are telling them about Raheem Sterling, because racism is the greatest evil in our society, and there's just no excuse for it. So when Raheem Sterling, for example, goes to Burnley, he's got no form with Burnley. He's done nothing to Burnley supporters. Burnley fans booing Raheem Sterling is inexcusable for that reason. And that's not quite the same as what happened to David Beckham. But I think the most sensible people, of course, can see what the tabloids are doing with Raheem Sterling, and not just Raheem Sterling. After England lost to Iceland, I think Carl Walker got hounded for, I think he said he'd rather be on holiday than be with England, or something like that, a text message he sent, and Dele Alli went on holiday, and that was unacceptable. And whereas Roy Hodgson, for example, who, if you were to say who was at fault for England getting beaten by Iceland, I would certainly say most of the blame there goes to Roy Hodgson. Roy Hodgson mainly got away without that kind of aggravation. Harry Kane mainly got away without that kind of aggravation. And it was actually the players of colour who sort of bore the brunt of the tabloid fury for that, for their insubordination during the competition, and then for daring to enjoy themselves after the competition. And I think most people are able to see that for what that is. And what you've got now is you've got an England team that is full of players of colour and full of white players, but also full of players of colour, but is more likeable than any England team has been for a long time. And most sensible people are able to see, actually, these guys are putting it all out there. They're enjoyable to watch. They actually give the sense that they're enjoying themselves. And I think that's quite important as a supporter as well, that where you see that the players of your team are enjoying this amazing privilege, that is quite compelling and quite contagious. And people see that that's what's happening. They've got Gareth Southgate, a manager who's allowing them to express themselves, who doesn't at the moment seem to be bowed by the pressure and bowed by the demands of the press. And what you're seeing is it's actually working quite nicely. They might go and it might be a disaster, but actually the England team are quite a positive advert for England as a country, and they're quite actually the opposite of what the tabloid press have been telling us. And it's quite interesting with the tabloid press because it doesn't come from the sports writers. It comes from people that have just got to write an article. I mean, I don't know quite how the instructions to write this kind of article are dispersed. Go and write something nasty about Raheem Sterling. Can we have a dog whistle about Dele Alli, please? But the sports pages that are read by sports fans are not really like that. And actually, the thing that I'm now thinking is it would be really nice if Gareth Southgate said, do you know what, Mail? Do you know what, Sun? I'm not going to give you any interviews. You're banned from all my press conferences, so you stop racially abusing my players. And I think if Gareth Southgate did that, I think there'd be quite a lot of support for him, because the sense that you get is that people have had enough of this.
That would be amazing. I can't see it happening just yet, because the fear of retribution and the backlash as soon as anything goes wrong would be, you know, it's so predictable that that backlash would be so violent and so virulent that Southgate would be really risking something. And yet it feels like maybe this is a moment in history where people are actually willing to take those risks. You think about what's happening in the States with their athletes standing up and taking a stand and actually standing for something that they believe in. That maybe Southgate and this England team might be capable of doing that. On the field, apart from the fact that they seem to be enjoying themselves and actually being able to express themselves as a team with individual identities, you do get the sense that this is actually a very talented group of players. I'm just not quite sure if they're maybe at the same stage as the 98 team were in terms of their development, that they're not quite there as a grown-up team just yet.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, Gareth Southgate was saying that, said yesterday that they're not the finished article and they're not close to the finished article. And that's true. I mean, in the end, that 1998 team, they had Paul Ince, they had Alan Shearer, they had Michael Owen, they had David Beckham, they had Tony Adams. They had proper, serious players in that generation of football. The current England team has players that would like to become that, but they don't have any world-class players at their peak, not one. They don't have a single player who has done it, I don't think. I mean, maybe I'm forgetting someone, but I don't think they've got anyone who has turned it on in the later stages of the Champions League yet. They haven't got many medals between them. They haven't played in many big games between them. But, and this is a good but, if you catch them on a good day, they are a hard night for anyone. I think the problem might be keeping out the better teams. So when they play Germany, Brazil, whoever it happens to be, France, they're not going to have a lot of the ball because they don't have midfielders that are capable of keeping the ball. They could annihilate any defence on the break, but the problem is, are they capable of absorbing the kind of pressure that you would need to absorb for that tactic to work? They probably aren't, but they are able to compete with those teams because none of the teams that we mention are that good. So if someone says to you they know who's going to win the World Cup, this particular World Cup, I mean, they're making it up because Germany, France, Brazil are all roughly as good as each other, Spain, and could all beat each other on a particular day. And so there's no outstanding team who you think, well, they're just going to mow through the opposition. But I think that England are capable of giving any of those teams a game. It's not a 50-50 game, it's a 70-30 game. But we've seen much worse teams beat much better teams where the standards are relative. England's any of the favourites. So it is possible. I wouldn't be that surprised if England beat Belgium or got a draw with Belgium and did enough to win the group and then earn themselves a slightly easier route through the competition. They're not going to win it because in the end you probably have to beat a team that is better than you in 3 consecutive rounds, and that is unlikely. But you just don't know how it's going to work out because you never know how the route's going to open up. Maybe you'll get to play in 1990. England got to the semi-finals, and who had they played? I mean, they played Belgium in the quarterfinal in their last 16, who they beat with the last second goal. They were lucky. Then they were lucky to beat Cameroon in the quarterfinals, and all of a sudden they're in the semi-finals. So you're never quite sure how the tournament's going to pan out. But again, I guess that England team had better players than this one, but it didn't probably have its pace or its attacking variety. And so I don't think anyone will particularly want to play England.
Daniel, great stuff. Enjoy the entire tournament. We'll check in with you real soon. Thanks a million.
See you again. Bye-bye.